This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. This is episode number 100 for the show, and it's a milestone that, quite honestly, I didn't think that we would ever achieve. But here we are, and I wanted to take a moment to send out a huge thank you to all of the previous guests on the show. It's been a fantastic ride and a wonderful adventure for me, and I hope it's been the same for all of our listeners. And speaking of which, I also want to thank the thousands of people who have downloaded or listened to the show. You're the whole reason that Aidpreneur exists, and I hope you keep tuning in. Over the last 2 years, we've had some pretty amazing conversations with development and aid professionals about how they made it and what tricks and tips and advice they have for creating a sustainable and satisfying career. I'm happy to say that I think we have a fairly solid answer to that question right now. And because of this, it's time for us to pivot to a new topic, one that I find more fascinating every day, but also one that is increasingly on the forefront of our community's thought leaders. The topic's innovation. Going forward, I'll be talking with guests who are on the cutting edge of innovation in how we deliver development and humanitarian aid assistance, and we'll be investigating how innovation happens, what innovations are out there now, and what the future might hold. So, without further ado, I can't think of a better way to kick off this new direction than with Andrew Schroeder. Andrew is the co-founder of WeRobotics, a global nonprofit organization which works with local communities and international organizations to accelerate aid, development, environmental protection, and global health with robotics technologies. Andrew is also the Director of Research and Analysis for Direct Relief, a nonprofit organization that's based in Santa Barbara, California, which distributes essential medicines to local healthcare programs in over 100 countries. Andrew is a globally recognized leader in the use of spatial analysis and geographic information systems for humanitarian aid and health. In 2013, Andrew won the President's Award from ESRI, and if you don't know who they are, they're kind of the grandfather of GIS, for his contributions to GIS for social good. He received his PhD in social and cultural analysis from New York University and his master's in public policy from the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. I spoke with Andrew in California. Hello, Andrew. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. It's great to be here. It's an honor.
Where are you sitting today? I know you travel like a demon, so where are you at today?
I'm in Santa Barbara, California, where it is just a beautiful day.
Great. Well, at least we're on the same side of the planet today. I know that you have some world travel coming up here. I'm super psyched to have you on the show. This is the 100th episode of Terms of Reference, and this is the kicking off our new series on innovations in the development and aid sector. It couldn't be more appropriate because of the two organizations that you work with. One is Direct Relief, and the other is WeRobotics. Direct Relief, I was doing some research before the show. I think you've won more awards for innovation and being just general badasses than anybody I've ever seen before. So I'd like to talk about that. But then WeRobotics is a new initiative that you started recently that I think is doing some really cool stuff. Why don't we start out by you giving us the overview of both of those organizations and not only what you do with them, but what's their contribution to the development and aid world?
Sure. I'll start with WeRobotics since it's the new one. My colleague Patrick Meyer and a couple of other colleagues of ours that work in the drone world on the commercial side have put together a new nonprofit that's focused on building new models for how we apply robotics technology, starting with the aerial robots that we call drones, to key problems in aid, development, environmentalism, and global health. And we see all those as pretty linked together. And we're building up innovation labs in areas of the world that are experiencing a lot of integrated risk. So starting in places like Kathmandu, Nepal, where we've been working for a while on using aerial robots to do earthquake, post-disaster assessment surveys, build three-dimensional models, things like that, and really work with local partners to make them more capable of addressing those problems using all of the new technology that's coming out of the robotics field. And then Direct Relief is a very distinct organization from WeRobotics. I'm the Director of Research and Analysis. Direct Relief distributes essential medicines around the world, so it works in the global health space. We also work in disaster relief, making sure that people after disasters can be reconnected with reliable supplies of essential medicines and medical supplies. And in that context, I really focus on statistical analysis and geographic information systems. So using spatial analysis to understand where people are at risk, what kind of medical conditions they are subject to, and how we can best help them to make their situations better off through support for the medical system. So, I've learned a lot from both, and I sort of do both of those in different respects. I think they conceptually have something to do with one another. It's sort of two branches of what I'm working on.
Sure. And I mean, as anybody in the innovation field will say, I mean, if you don't have your fingers in a bunch of different pots, you're doing something wrong, right? So I want to start with direct relief just for a minute, because Fast Company named you recently one of the world's 10 most innovative nonprofits, especially for the use of your mapping technology, which is one of the things that you concentrate on. What is it about either use of maps or how you deliver the aid assistance that makes it different than some of the other NGOs or nonprofits out there?
So what Fast Company was really focusing on in that case was work that we did in the Ebola crisis, which was about delivery of essential medicines out to remote areas using efficient mechanisms that are driven by commercial grade systems applied to areas that they're not normally applied to. So direct relief, runs SAP and has customized SAP to be able to, aggregate and distribute medicines and medical supplies in a way that is not really different from how a lot of other commercial companies would sort of do that, but we do it for people that have no ability to pay for the medicine, that live in really remote areas and are subject to really extreme circumstances. And we've connected that together with GIS to be able to really highly contextualize that commercial distribution model. So in that case, being able to look at data that's coming in from a variety. We work with the UN public health studies that are being done in, for instance, in West Africa around movement of population and the risks that they're occurring around exposure to disease. And then we don't just do that for research. We actually tie that directly in, like I said, to highly efficient commercial grade distribution mechanisms. And the connection between those two, between applied epidemiology, GIS, very, very sort of data intensive approach to research linked to this very efficient distribution model, I think is unique in the development world. We're able to do a lot of work that way at very low cost and get it out into the places that need it the most.
Do you think that also contributes to your ability to work with commercial organizations, maybe receive funding from new places that other traditional NGOs aren't able to get it from? Is that part of your sell?
Yeah, I mean, we work with large-scale corporate pharma and, much smaller scale pharmaceutical organizations, corporations as well. And that we speak the same language in terms of our data structures, in terms of the ability to comply with international regulations in the pharmaceutical industry, which are getting, more and more strict over time. So historically, there may have been a bit of divergence between nonprofit organizations and corporate medical manufacturers around the kinds of standards applied to the way that medical material gets handled. There was maybe a bit of a two-track system where between humanitarian and market-based. And I think that divergence is largely going away. So direct relief is able to work in the humanitarian space to, be able to direct material towards people that are in need of humanitarian assistance because they're at risk and can't pay for the material, but to do it in a way that directly sort of directly complies with the commercial standards that you would do if you were that you would follow if you were actually distributing for any other kind of market, and that's getting more and more effective over time. And I think that's the role that data plays in the whole process as well. This is what you would do if you were trying to sell to a market. You would try to understand where people live, what they need, what their ability to use the material is, your relative competitive landscape. You would try to assemble the best information possible to be able to, improve your profit, profile, be able to grow your business. That applied to humanitarianism is something which it may not sound earth-shaking, but actually it is in the way that we're able to operate extremely lean, but do a very large amount of work. Direct relief will distribute over $900 million at minimum wholesale acquisition cost in aid over this past year. And this has grown, sort of steadily over the last 10 years at least. So that's a large amount of assistance with a very small profile, very targeted in where it's going.
That's amazing. Flip over to the other side of the coin. WeRobotics, did you kind of wake up one day? Now Patrick Meyer, full disclosure, he's been on our show before. I can't remember his exact episode off the top of my head, but we've been lucky enough to have him on the show. Have you known Patrick for a long time? And you guys are just drone geeks together, because he talked about drones for good as well. And you and the bunch of other colleagues who started WeRobotics, or has this been something that's been simmering for a long time, and now it's just there's sort of a convergence of technology, opportunity, all those kinds of things?
I mean, it's kind of both. I've known Patrick for a couple of years now, and we've collaborated since probably the end of 2014 on an organization called UAviators, the Humanitarian UAV Network. UAviators was Patrick's brainchild after Typhoon Haiyan, where, a lot of us were out in the Philippines doing disaster relief. There were a number of us, and myself included, that worked on experiments in the application of drones to relief operations. And at the time, it was pretty disconnected. We were disconnected from one another. Nobody coordinated with anyone else. We were just sort of like seeing whether this worked. I did some imaging of health facilities. We made some simple maps, and we tried to see where this goes. And Patrick began connecting everyone together, working with OCHA, World Bank, Red Cross, in my case, Direct Relief, and a number of other organizations to begin kind of pulling the field together. So that's why it's a network. That was done. So like you guys,
this is like basically creating almost a market. I mean, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think about it that way. I mean, we didn't make any money on it. So
no, but I mean, to say, for Patrick or whomever to say there are these disparate players doing these things, and I'm going to consolidate it and bring them together and create a body of knowledge. That's groundbreaking.
Thank you. I think the idea was brilliant at the time, and it's also an incredible amount of work and hard to sustain. And it also ran into a number of challenges. I mean, when Nepal, the earthquake in Nepal happened, UAviators was asked, and Patrick in particular was asked to do a lot of coordination activity, but the structures really weren't in place for that coordination to be really effective. And I think one of the key missing pieces was that local organizations were not effectively incorporated into what we were doing, how we were doing it, and, sort of where the need was greatest relative to the available technology. That's, I think, one of the big things that we're trying to correct with in WeRobotics, that we need to not just be international agencies kind of floating around there, popping in every now and then when really bad stuff happens, and then trying to apply extremely sophisticated technology to these problems. We need to ground that technology and the capabilities that it kind of opens up in people that live in those areas that are subject to high risk or subject to extreme events, poverty, and other kinds of health concerns, and really get them to work as close collaborative partners, on a long-term institutional basis. That's the way we're going to sustain this activity. That's the way we're going to really transfer this work out where it's most needed, and do something, I think, not only impactful, but really new. Because, a lot of people use technology, but getting those partnerships right and those use cases right is I think, new.
So you'd say for the next couple of years here, the key piece of this innovation in WeRobotics is it's the nature of the communication and the relationship building and basically the structure of making it work. It's less necessarily about the robotics and more about just getting the functionality of the system to happen.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. The robotics are important, and I think it's important that we also sort of stay in touch with the rapid development of the field. So this is one of the things that's quite distinctive about robotics right now, is that there are a number of things that are converging together simultaneously.
Give us some examples.
Well, I mean, you have, sensor technology that's rapidly developing. You have the ability for vehicles to be able to map their world around them and avoid obstacles, which you can now see commercially in the Phantom 4 from DJI. You'll see this everywhere soon. You have things that are getting cheaper, like LiDAR and multispectral imagery that's historically been quite expensive and exclusive, but is now becoming much more commercially available. Software that's able to process this stuff, ability to do cloud processing that can rapidly be distributed out to a wide array of people that need access to the information, and then artificial intelligence that's beginning to allow for autonomous activity, or at least semi-autonomous activity on the robotic side, which enables new forms of collaboration between people and machines. And that's sort of hitting the world. And, humanitarians are traditionally not right at the forefront of these kinds of developments. We're sort of like figuring it out in the back of the pack often. But we're often the people that are dealing with the places which will push these models most effectively, will really kind of figure out, how do you break the system and put it back together and really put it to work for positive social benefit. And that's what we're trying to do on the technology side, is really work with technology companies to transfer those kinds of models out into the humanitarian development, global health space. But what you're really right about in terms of the technology, in some respects being beside the point, is that what's important is the use cases and the people that are doing that work, and making sure that they're enabled in new ways. I think we really lose sight of this within humanitarian technology at times, that innovation becomes very technical. It becomes about the machines and the data and the software. And not to say that people ignore the use cases, but that they often can feel as though they're fading into the background at the expense of the more sort of whiz-bang gadgetry. That's not what we want to do. We want this stuff is important because it changes people's lives, and it changes the ability to do work like deliver medicine, to map areas that are at risk of flooding, and to really connect people up with new ways to plan for and respond to the events that are going to be hitting them. And I think that's where the real opportunities lie.
When you think about direct relief for a second, what's the biggest disruption or the innovation that you've seen sort of shake that particular space over the last 2 or 3 years, especially since you have your hand in mapping, as you were just saying, it's planning, predictive analytics, these kind of things. Is there one or two things you could point to that said, wow, that's really making a difference, or that is going to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's made the biggest difference in direct relief has been what I would think of as data integration. Doesn't sound that sexy, but we've done it in a lot of different ways.
I'm going to agree with you. It's not sexy, but that's cool. But yeah, so tell me about that. What do you mean by data integration?
Meaning that we get data from all over the place. Some of it we make ourselves. It comes from transactions. Some of it comes in from surveys. Some of it comes in from open data, other organizations, from the press, from a wide array of sources. And this stuff has been out there for a while, but there's so much of it. It's so diverse. It's so disparate that it can often feel as though you're not able to actually put it together in a way that actually affects the work you're doing. If you can actually get that information to cohere so that it talks to the pieces of information talk to one another. They're able to reference together, and we're able to think about them very clearly and efficiently in relationship to one another. So I mean, like disease reporting relative to economics, relative to our ability to distribute, relative to infrastructure, relative to the weather, relative to long-term changes in the climate, and on and on and on. The more integrated that picture becomes, the more you're able to use it to get real work done. And we've approached that problem in a bunch of different ways. GIS is one way. We spent a couple of years working with Palantir Technologies when their philanthropy program was working with us around exactly the same kind of thing. SAP is, from the enterprise data point of view, has been a similar kind of thing where it's been about broad-based integration of that information. But the key is that you have this very, very big, diverse, disparate data sources that get put together in an efficient way to really affect decision making. That's made the biggest difference by far.
Is there like a particular example, like one particular example you would be able to share right now? Would it be like your Ebola response or your response in Nepal, where you could say, we drew from all these resources and we said, oh, you know what? Rather than going to point A, we should be delivering in point B rather than where everybody else isn't. Is there a story like that?
There's a lot of them. I was thinking the other day back to Hurricane Sandy in New York City, actually, where, Direct Relief is not just an international organization. Mm-hmm. We also work in the United States, and we did a lot of work in New York City after Hurricane Sandy. And, it turns out that although it's in New York City, we didn't necessarily know a ton about what was happening at the time or pre-existing landscape for all the things that were required to respond to the medical system. But in that particular case, we started getting information in about the power outages. It turns out that fuel became a really significant issue for people. I ended up looking at gas station networks relative to where you're seeing power outages, and we were able to connect up with people that were doing homeless outreach that needed access to fuel and frame an issue that we previously had not necessarily thought through, and allowed us to actually improve services for homeless adults in New York City that were subject to displacement and other kinds of health risks following Hurricane Sandy. And the thing that was interesting to me about that was that it's not something I need to know all the time. I don't need to know about electricity and fuel networks and all that kind of stuff in order to do humanitarian aid. But when I do need to know it, I need to be able to put that together and direct it towards the key problem here, which is access to services for homeless adults and homeless families that were being disconnected and marginalized because of the way in which they were impacted by that particular extreme event. It's very similar, actually, to the Ebola crisis. And if you think about it, we're able to, I can't do anything about the road networks normally. I don't build roads or, I'm not investing in that particular area, but we're able, when we need to plug in with people that do know about the differences in various transport opportunities or networks within the country, and then link that into information about where you're seeing bandwidth access, where you're seeing a creation of new health infrastructure, put that together, and then look at where the gaps are in there. So where do I need to fill in my resources? We were able to identify health facilities that were not being supplied effectively, where they were in need of additional support for transport and additional resources that we could connect with other groups to be able to fill in their communications pictures. So that was able to bring a kind of cohesive response to bear in those institutions and to frame the issues appropriately. So one of the things we began learning was that Ebola was not just an issue that was about the Ebola virus per se. It was a systems issue. It was actually an impact on everyone. People began avoiding health facilities. They began not having a skilled attendance at birth. They began not having access to medical care for all the other things that were going on because of the impact on the system. So how do you understand where those response efforts need to be directed? You need to actually go and pull in data from other organizations, from reporting from the UN, from reporting from what our partners are able to tell us, what we're able to get back through surveys, assemble that together, and then find out where those ripple effects are happening that are not being reported in the press necessarily, but are incredibly important to the health of the people that we're trying to help.
Wow, those are two very, very excellent stories, and just super, I'm going to edit this out myself, but just fantastic way of bringing that all together. Thinking for a second, you're an innovator. You're clearly you're lucky enough to be a part of the WeRobotics now, let's call it a movement, let's call it an organization, whatever we want. But you're also part of Direct Relief. Could you juxtapose for me how innovation happens in both of those scenarios? Direct relief, large organization, 70 employees, 400 volunteers, global in nature, as you said, $900 million in assistance, or just in just the assistance that you bought and distributed last year. Is it something that direct relief is always, you're sort of thinking, hey, you've got an innovation fund and you're investing in everything, or does it just sort of bubble up from many different places? And then how do you juxtapose that to sort of the entrepreneurial venture of WeRobotics?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't often think about how it happens, actually. I just sort of go ahead and do things, which maybe that's actually how innovation happens. If I actually stop to think about it too much, there are probably things I wouldn't do. But the way it works in direct relief has been that there are, it's a very defined problem set. We need to find gaps in health systems and figure out the best way to fill those gaps. And then my role has been to figure out how we approach that problem from a number of different points of view and find out all the various ways that I can try to answer that question. And it turns out that the balance between that very, very narrow problem set, it's a sort of ultra specific question, with the limitless potential of, figure out any way to go do that and apply technology and think about it in a multidisciplinary framework, link together all the various fields and tools that are needed to be able to laser in on that specific thing. I think that those two scales actually produce a really interesting innovation context. If I were trying to do everything issue-wise, then it might actually be harder in that context. So that's why we're able to use GIS expansively to answer very, very, very narrow questions. And precision becomes what drives the innovation. In WeRobotics, it's sort of the opposite, where we're looking at a very open problem set. So the number of things that could be addressed are actually quite broad. I named off disaster relief, aid, global health, and environmental protection. The number of subtopics within that is in the thousands. So, but it's a very specific technological approach. So we're looking at computers that are able to act in the world, enabling remote action at a distance. And what are all of the various ways that specific technological approach can make a difference in this expansive issue space. And I think that, again, is that dynamic between very, very specific focus and the kind of broad kind of way of looking at it. That contradiction drives innovation. It forces you to be creative. I think the other thing that's common to the two is that in both cases, I've really tried to think from the ground up about first the people that are going to be benefited and then the approaches. So, this is one of the reasons that I travel a lot, is that I actually I try to listen very clearly to the people that we work with. We work with local healthcare partners in direct relief. I was just in Sierra Leone and Liberia working on a number of different issues. And I got to really hear the stories of the people that we were out working with and understand their problems close up. And then on the other hand, WeRobotics, again, we're working with technology transfer to local organizations and making sure that those local organizations are able to, articulate why they need robotics and what they're going to do with that. So that listening to the local becomes, it really drives the application space in new ways. You learn things that you would never have thought of if you only were to approach it from the standpoint of the technology or your organization.
Only a couple more questions. Being on the cutting edge, or being on the bleeding edge in this case, especially with WeRobotics and in direct relief, is there a moment that you can identify or something you could think of in the past when innovation has just become standard ops or has become the norm? We're talking about GIS, we're talking about mapping here and using mapping to be more precise about aid delivery. That's not new, right? That's been around forever. But the way that you're applying it right now is cutting edge. I'm just thinking about, robotics in general. Can you see a time when people are like, oh yeah, of course, we're just gonna, we're gonna send out the drone. That's what we do. Is there a way that happens, or is it just something where the society becomes comfortable with this new way of doing something? Yeah,
I think it happens in a bunch of different ways. There isn't like one moment, but I think it's a combination of cost, the the access to technology and the number of people that begin actually using something. So in the case of drones, for instance, I mean, what's been remarkable about it is that, 5 years ago, this was considered to be a space that was largely expensive, complex, associated with, military or quasi-military applications in the popular imagination primarily, and was potentially inaccessible to the broad expanse of people in the country, with whether you're talking about the United States or the world. And that changed extremely fast because, the cost changed. So
everyone I know has a drone. It's ridiculous now.
Yeah, you can buy extremely useful technology for, a fraction of the cost now that you could buy it 5 years ago. So the rapid fall in price really changed the number of people that were able to access the technology. When you change the number of people that are able to access technology, you change essentially the research into what it does. So people do all kinds of things that you never thought they would do with it. And they can do that because it's cheap and accessible. So that, creates a kind of fluency and a kind of creative undercurrent where you see people doing stuff and you can learn from what they're doing and learn in unexpected ways. And then, when you then can increase the comfort level of organizations to be able to adopt some of these technologies and put them to work, then you can begin to create systems around them. And I think from the humanitarian side, it's the creation of systems around them, incorporating them into the workflows that people are using, that becomes the real transformative moment, actually, where it becomes not just a nice kind of interesting thing, but becomes directed around resource flows. GIS is a great example of that actually 10 years ago, GIS existed, obviously. It's existed for a few decades now, but was not incorporated seriously into the workflows of various organizations. What changed the dynamic for GIS was Google Earth. Google Earth was free. People began to use it for Google Earth and Google Maps that began to use it for just basic navigation. The use cases built up. You could access it everywhere ubiquitously, and then you could get really creative about applications in tough problems. And then demand was created to do more sophisticated stuff with this. And so, pre-existing systems through ESRI or through, other kinds of companies that had a business model for analysis and, more kind of heavy lifting were there to take up the slack when you could get this like undercurrent throughout the population. That was transformative, but it really wasn't until Google Earth was able to kind of broaden that out that you could have that kind of sort of takeoff moment. Drones is probably DJI. When DJI and to some degree the Parrot, which produces commercial drones, was able to bring the cost down and make them stable and feel safe, get them out well into the hands of the population, you could have that takeoff moment that I described earlier.
Mm. My last question for you today, even though in my mind I've got 1,000, but to keep it succinct, who are you paying attention to right now? Are there individual people, organizations, movements, trends, particular technologies that you pay attention to and geek out on? You're like, wow, that's kind of cool stuff for the future. Please do name names if you can.
I pay attention to a lot of the developments going on in the drone field. So, folks that there have been, I can maybe get back to you with sort of list on this if it would be helpful. But
yes, please. I'd love to be able to put it up on the post.
There's a group that I've worked with recently that Patrick and I collaborate with, say, on the problem of how do you deliver commodities, essential commodities, via robots in emergencies. So there's a group called VIU, which was formed by a medical student out of the University of Michigan that has developed a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft that can carry goods in the 1 to 2 kilogram range, customized really around the use case for health systems in remote areas, so that it's cheap, it's stable, you can fly 40 to 50 kilometers, and we can begin to really think through the problem of getting around terrestrial transport systems for key health commodities. I think this is a huge development in the field that, when Jeff Bezos went on 60 Minutes, he was and talked about Amazon delivery. I mean, he was practically laughed off the stage and people thought it was a gimmick. Within a couple short years, you're seeing startups like Vayu and a couple of others that are, really pushing the envelope and creating a whole new way to get material out into the field. Matternet is another really good example of this. Matternet is a company that was founded out of Singularity University that has a different approach to the technology. They're creating networks of multi-rotor drones that can carry material around. But the vision of being able to, for, highly vulnerable people around the world, remote areas, really tough problems, get essential goods out efficiently using robotics and circumventing the things that have plagued aid for decades now, bad roads, bad weather, very remote areas. I think this is going to change things in significant ways. As we get research out there that shows how this has actually been applied, I think it's going to really open things up in an enormous way. So I think payload delivery for using robotics is probably the leading edge of the field right now.
Andrew, thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been absolutely fascinating.
Thanks, Stephen. It's been an honor.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.